All right, welcome to the Quick Media Come Follow Me series. This is Doctrine and Covenants. We're focusing on Joseph Smith history 1 through 26, essentially the first vision here. A couple of things I want to point out before we get into the nitty-gritty here on Joseph Smith history and on the first vision. Number one, there are about 9 accounts, right? More, there's actually probably more, but officially the church says there's about 9 different accounts that they have of Joseph Smith talking about the first vision. Some of them are kind of sanctioned. Some of them are from witnesses that heard him speak about the first vision. I had a member of the study group say something about how, bring up a quote about how, looking back at history, it's hard to say what history is true, right? In other words, we've grown up for the most part after about more around the turn of the century in the 1900s, looking at Joseph Smith history and the first vision as a bedrock principle and a bedrock event of the restoration. Before that, it wasn't, right? Because it wasn't talked about that much. And there's, we've got all these different versions of the first vision, which is great, but it's taken a while now for us to start kind of move back on the pendulum and not be focused just on Joseph Smith history. There's more to the story, and there is a lot more richness if we can put things into context here and understand kind of what was happening. We look back on history oftentimes. This goes to the quote of the study group member. And as I like to say, we're all Monday morning historians, right? Instead of a Monday morning quarterback, we're all Monday morning historians. We look back and we all have our own opinion. We all have our own views of what has happened and transpired. The he said, she said type of thing, right? And so the more information we can get, the more we can understand what has happened. So that's one thing to look at. The second thing is as I was implying, this wasn't talked about very much early on. It was not a something that when the missionaries would go out, when they would preach, they didn't talk a lot about the first vision because Joseph Smith rarely talked about it. And you would think, well, why wouldn't he go through this? Why wouldn't he talk a lot more about, he saw the Father and the Son. Well, how much do you talk about the temple? Right? It's something that on one end is very sacred and very personal to him. And I think we need to see that. It's hard to view like, okay, this is the opening of the heavens for the last dispensation for all of us, but it was also a deeply personal experience for Joseph Smith that, by the way, many other prophets have gone through, especially dispensational prophets, right? And so the other thing is when he came back, right, and he tells the minister, as we get in the example of Joseph Smith history, what happens, right? He's a teenage boy. He gets ridiculed. He gets mocked. He gets, remember what the frenzy of the moment there of the Great Awakening and all of this fervor, this religious, spiritual fervor that's going on in New England in the early 19th century. Passions were running very, very high. And so for Joseph Smith, you can imagine what kind of adversity would face him when he's going against everything that everybody's talking about and something's deeply personal to everyone, which is your religious experience and what is truth in that religion. And here Joseph Smith is saying, look, the heavens opened to me and I saw the Father and the Son and et cetera, et cetera. You can see how from the reaction that he would have had in many cases, possibly a very traumatic type of experience after that. And another thing to look at in terms of looking at this as something very sacred and personal to Joseph Smith is that if you look in the Gospels, and we see oftentimes this example, at least a couple times in the Gospels, of Mary, where, for example, Gabriel comes, right, and speaks to her. And afterward, we're told from the author of the Gospels, each of the Gospels, that and Mary kept this to herself, right? In other words, it was something that was deeply personal to her. It wasn't something that would have gone out to everybody right away, necessarily. She would have kept some of these things very close to her and not gone over them. It was a very sacred event. If you had an angel appear to you, you may say something to your family and maybe a couple others, but who's going to believe you, for one thing? And where do you cross the line as far as putting pearls before the swine, so to speak? Right? And so this whole thing here about, it wasn't canonized early on. We didn't have the pearl of great price till later in the 19th century. This is not something that the early saints really anchored on as far as the story and event, right, of the first vision. And there is a separation between the idea of the organization of the church and of the first vision, right? We don't hear about a new church that needs to be formed anywhere in the accounts that we have from Joseph Smith's first vision. We do hear about the gospel. We do hear about the new and everlasting covenant. That's very important. But we don't hear about the church. And so these are separate things in a sense. And I think the early, a historian would know this much better than me, but I think that it looks like in the early 19th century that, the focus was more on the fact that the church was restored and that it had a prophet. And that here's the organization of the church, and here's the Book of Mormon, and Joseph Smith is the prophet of the restoration. Right, but there wasn't that element of the first vision was not real strong in there anyway. It doesn't appear. All right, so that's one thing I want to look at. There's actually two more that I want to cover here before we get in. Number two is that, let me just read this from the 1832 account, right? And I'm going to go down into the account just a little bit here. It says here that the light or the fire, right, came down from above and rested upon me, and I was filled with the Spirit of God. And the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord. That's interesting. He's using, almost like he's using the Lord here as two different uses here of each of the personages. But the phrase I want to look at here is that he opened the heavens upon me. Now, if we go back, right, again, just like I did in the last episode, I want to drive home here the point that this is the continuation, in a sense, of the Book of Mormon. This is why Moroni is the messenger. It's not just because he's delivering the Book of Mormon that he finished up. Right? It's that Moroni is the last known prophet that we have with the fullness of the gospel, with the Melchizedek priesthood. That's really important. Right? We have the Book of Mormon, which has, despite what some critics say, the fullness of the gospel in it. Why? Because its focus is on the Abrahamic covenant, on the eternal covenant, the great and everlasting, the new and everlasting covenant. And that's what's missing in the time of Joseph Smith. And that's what's got to be brought back. And sure enough, as you'll see here in the next couple of weeks, that's what Moroni goes over before he ever goes over the Book of Mormon or anything else. It's the restoration of the new and everlasting covenant in the setting of the last days. But if we look at Moroni's message, right, which was his father Mormon's message, that the heavens have been closed in his time, that the people first started denying Christ and the doctrine of Christ, they let that slip, and then everything else with the higher law, which is what the new and everlasting covenant is, started to fall apart, right? And then eventually, of course, the people start to fall apart, and they fall into sin, and eventually they're annihilated It gets to that point. And what is Moroni and Mormon's message to us in the last writings that we have? It's don't close the heavens, right? Remember in Ether 12, remember that in Mormon asks Moroni to finish his record, which is the little space he has left on this plate that Mormon has engraven on. And so Moroni goes in and he writes chapters 8 and 9 of the Book of Mormon. And he focuses on his father's message of faith, hope, and charity and spiritual gifts, right? And Christ, the doctrine of Christ. Then we go to the abridgment of Ether, which is what Moroni does next. And you go to chapter 12, where Moroni very much so inserts his own writing in there, in that chapter 12. And again, we get faith, hope, and charity and Christ. He talks about him seeing Christ. And there's a focus from Moroni on the abridgment of talking about the brother of Jared seeing Christ. Why? Well, it's not just about the doctrine of Christ. It's a message from Moroni that Mormon was giving to the people and to his son, that they had closed the heavens, and that's why they are falling apart. That's why they're being annihilated. At the very end with Moroni 10, same thing. We talk about that chapter about Moroni 10:4 and how it's all about the Book of Mormon, but putting it into context and learning about the Book of Mormon being true, right? If you pray about it, but putting it into context, it's a continuation of this message about the heavens being closed. It's about prayer. It's about calling up and opening up the heavens. And that chapter also is about faith, hope, and charity and all of the spiritual gifts that you would get down from heaven. So at the end of the Book of Mormon, with Moroni and his primary message there about the heavens being closed and make sure you don't close the heavens, then the continuation of that at this time here comes right to Joseph Smith with what happening? What is it that happens here? The heavens are opened to a farm boy, a teenage boy. And from here, the dispensation will little by little occur of priesthood keys, ordinances, truths, prophecies fulfilled, etc. So that is how I think we ought to be looking at that, right? You've got to bring the Book of Mormon and the opening of the new dispensation here with Joseph Smith together. It works. They fit together very, very closely. Then the third thing I want to cover here is we look at the Joseph Smith history, as I said, very much, or the first vision account, very much as this anchor for the restoration. And it is. But it is also a deeply personal message to Joseph Smith. And it is a very similar experience that many other prophets have had. And in some cases, to the point of being almost exactly alike to what these other prophets have experienced. Let's go, for example, back to Lehi. And a lot of us think about I talk a lot about Lehi's dream, right? But there was another vision that is recorded in 1 Nephi 1. In fact, there's two visions in 1 Nephi 1 that Lehi has. And in the first one, in chapter 1, verse 6, it says, "And it came to pass as he prayed," being Nephi talking about his father Lehi, "as he prayed unto the Lord, there came a pillar of fire and dwelt upon a rock," right? Came down, dwelt upon a rock before him. Now, this is interesting here. "And he saw and heard much." So same example here. Why isn't Nephi going through this? Now, it's very possible, perhaps likely, that Lehi had already gone through this in the lost 116 pages, right? That he gets very specific, perhaps, about what he sees. But maybe not. It's the same idea with Joseph Smith that I was bringing up previously. We don't know how much of that is really going to be revealed. Maybe in writing it's a lot easier to do. But how much did did he really give out to even his family? "But because of the things which he saw and heard, he did quake and tremble exceedingly." So we can imagine these are pretty profound things, perhaps events, and perhaps an understanding of the heavens a little bit more that would be very concerning and driving some fear into a human being. But when he gets back to his own home at Jerusalem, he says that he cast himself upon his bed, and being overcome with the Spirit and the things which he had seen, he was overcome by that Spirit and carried away in a vision. I think that's an important thing to understand. He's carried away in a vision. Is this something he's sitting there and he sees in his body? Or does he have to be carried away and enter into a spiritual world? It says that even that he saw the heavens open, right? The veil is removed. And he thought he saw God sitting upon his throne, surrounded with numberless concourses of angels in the attitude of singing and praising their God. And then he talks about one being brighter than the others, the luster above that of the sun, and that's the Savior, right? And then 12 others, etc. And there's discussions about the sun, about stars, about a lot of things that we get in some of these other visions from the prophets. But it seems like there's an ascension process here that happens. There's a lot of writings that are non-canonical writings that are called apocalyptic writings. Now, we use the term apocalypse or apocalyptic in terms of doomsday, right, of the last days, of Sodom or of Gog and Magog type of thing, right? But that's not really what it means. We use that term today that way because of the book of Revelation and what it talks about happening in the last days or in the times of the early saints, which are to us, very apocalyptic, because the name of the book of Revelation in Greek is apocalypse, right? So apocalyptic means revelation. So apocalyptic writings are an extreme version of Revelation in a sense. They're the heavens opening. And in these writings, you see things like Abraham being taken away. In fact, even metaphorically written where he's taken away on a bird and he ascends up and sees many things. Or Isaiah, same idea. Daniel. Enoch is another example of that. Well, here we have Lehi, where there's kind of an idea of an ascension. And I think that's important to understand because as we have talked a lot about temple drama, a lot of that mirrors, I think, what these experiences reveal to the prophets. In many ways, these are endowment experiences, right? They are being brought up through the ascension up to the throne of God, and that's usually what's mentioned. There might be a lot more between that, but they're brought up to the throne of God, to the Holy of Holies, to the celestial room, and there they see God and angels and others, right? Or with Isaiah in Isaiah 6, right? There's God and there's the seraphim, and there might be other angels or the cherubim or whatever else we want to talk about that are characters in these types of scenes. The book of Revelation, same type of thing. They're going into a spiritual world that is very difficult to portray, to articulate in mortal terms. So some of these other accounts, we get just a little bit more information that fills these things in for us. Because, again, what we want to look at here is putting ourselves in Joseph Smith's shoes. Well, we want to know where he's walked. We know that he was inquisitive. We know that he went to pray to get answers. We also know that he went to have his sins forgiven of him. But we want to have a better idea of what he went through, because that is also for us. And I think that if we think about a temple experience, we have a better idea of what the first vision was. Okay, so I'm going to go down here to verse 10 in Joseph Smith history. And let's start there with this example, and then we'll move to some of the other accounts. Verse 10, in the midst of this war of words and tumult of opinions, all the religious frenzy that's going on here, I often said to myself, what is to be done? Who of all these parties are right? Are they all wrong together? If any of them be right, which is it, and how shall I know it? So this is our example that we have of why he's going to go to the grove, but it's not the only reason. It's an important reason, but it's not the only reason. Remember, this account is given more in a narrative of restoration than it is of an ascension experience. So then he says in verse 11, while I was laboring under the extreme difficulties caused by the contests of these parties, right? The contests against each other, of religionists, I was one day reading the Epistle of James, 1st chapter and 5th verse. I think it's interesting that it's James here that is prompting him, triggering him to go pray, right? James is a lot about faith and works. Then it says, which reads, James 1:5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him, right? It's temple imagery. Knock, and it shall be given. And then he says in verse 14, so in accordance with this, my determination to ask of God, I retired to the woods to make the attempt. Well, the woods to him are very familiar. We'll get into that in just a second. It was on the morning of a beautiful, clear day early in the spring of 1820. It was the first time in my life that I had made such an attempt. For amidst all my anxieties, I had never as yet made the attempt to pray vocally. Well, this is very common for that time period, right? The custom of the day was for the father to always lead in prayer. Right, and we could look at that in the church today as kind of like a priesthood duty to always lead the family in prayer. Very different from what we do today, but that was the custom then. So it's not a surprise to see that a teenage boy here is going to go out and try praying vocally. That doesn't mean he hasn't prayed before, but out loud for the very first time at age 14, 15 years old. Okay, now, a couple of other things that we want to go through here in terms of setting the stage for why he's going to the woods, why he's going to the sacred grove. Again, let's go back to the 1832 account, which is the earliest one that we have. And it's the only one that's written specifically in Joseph Smith's handwriting. He says that going back all the way to age 12, that he was seriously thinking in regards to the important concerns of the welfare of my immortal soul, right? He's a very conscientious kid. He's worried about the welfare of his own soul at age 12, right? There's not a lot of 40-year-old men that are always worried about their soul, right? It says, this led him to searching the scriptures, believing as I was taught. In other words, the way he's taught from his family. I felt to mourn for my own sins and for the sins of the world. So this is the making of a prophet. This is who he is. He's worried about his own sins. What have I done wrong? What do I need to make up for? Where do I fall short? And he sees that man is in a fallen state. This is what he's been taught, right? The family reads the Bible a lot. They pray a lot. And so this becomes concerning to him. He wants to... You can see this as such an important principle, especially it's astounding that for somebody that young at 12 years old, right? He's worried about himself, but he's worried about mankind. He's worried about their well-being. And this is what helps drive him to the woods. And then this is the account again that talks about the heavens that were opened unto him. Now, let's go to the 1842 account, right? So the four larger accounts that we have are 1832, 1835. The one we have in Joseph Smith history is the 1838 account, and then we have the 1842 account, and then some other witnesses that have spoken up. But here in the 1842 account, it says, when about 14 years of age, I began to reflect upon the importance of being prepared for a future state. So same idea, very conscientious, worried about his well-being. I retired to a secret place in a grove. It's not the first time he's gone there. What he means is this is a secret area where he and his family would go to. Right? So this was a clearing. We know it was a clearing. Who made the clearing? Well, the Smith family did. They would have made the clearing. In fact, it looks like Joseph Smith, on perhaps the day prior, had left an axe in a stump, right, in the clearing. Why? Because he was chopping for firewood. Very possibly firewood that was for making fires under these large pots, these kettles, in order to make maple sugar, which is a way that the Smith family would have used that and probably sell that maple sugar. And it's something that helps distinguish perhaps the day that this actually happened. You have two researchers who, independent of one another, came up with the same day, right? One was based off of weather, and then someone else who brought it up going through the Enoch calendar, that they actually came up with the same day. What day was it? It was March 26th. Well, it's pretty much the only day that it would be, as we're told in verse 14 here, a beautiful, clear day that would have happened during that time, in that part of spring. So the likely day is March 26th. But this area here, this clearing, is a place that they probably would have gone to and had their family prayers perhaps, or maybe even where the family would have gone to discuss things, or to even read the Bible perhaps. I mean, that's just conjecture, but it was a familiar place to them. It was secret to the family. So now we're going to go back to the Pearl of Great Price version here, Joseph Smith history. He says, I kneeled down and began to offer up the desires of my heart to God. Okay, back to the 1832 account. I cried unto the Lord for mercy. All right, this is about his sins. For there was none else to whom I could go and to obtain mercy. This is very familiar. This is also oftentimes what the prophets are doing. They need to be purified. That's a part of the temple experience, whether you have made that connection or not. Right? That's part of what you're doing when you're going through the temple. Same thing we get in Isaiah 6. What does Isaiah do in this temple imagery? He's going through and one of the seraphim, we would think of it maybe as an angelic type of a figure, takes a hot coal from an altar and puts it to Isaiah's lips. Right? That is a metaphor, a Middle Eastern metaphor, at least Egyptian, and I think it goes beyond that, for repentance. Right? Isaiah needs to repent. Well, that's part of what you do when you go through that process of going through the temple before you get to see the throne of God. In Isaiah's case, it also happens probably to apply to the people and the temple, and maybe to Isaiah himself for following false traditions. That's just my take on it, my opinion. So Joseph Smith goes there to find forgiveness from the Lord. So here in the 1838 account, the Joseph Smith history account, it says, I kneeled down and began to offer the desires of my heart to God. So again, keep in mind here, he's in the grove. It's important to see this, that's to start with. He's in the grove. I had scarcely done so when immediately I was seized upon by some power which entirely overcame me. Well, this is very common. Think about Moses 1. What happens with Moses in his experience there upon the mountain with his vision with God? Right? He's left alone with Satan. And Satan tries to overcome him, tries to pull him his way. It's very, very common. You have to battle with Satan, with the opposition. You have to slay the dragon before you can have eternal life, which is what those myths or stories or fairy tales are about, right? Where before you can save the princess, you've got to slay the dragon before you can get the treasure. He says that this being entirely overcame him and had such an astonishing influence over me as to bind my tongue so that I could not speak. Thick darkness gathered around me. So we're moving against creation here, right? Instead of getting light and order, we're going backwards here. It's the opposite way, the opposite direction. Thick darkness gathered around me, and it seemed to me for a time as I were doomed to sudden destruction. But exerting all my power, so this is important to understand to apply to us in this example, I think. So he's being, as an outside force is trying to get him, is trying to overtake him. Well, we get this all the time through temptation. We get this all the time through depression, anxiety, a lot of different things that are evil, right? They're evil things to us. Why are they evil? It's not that we're evil in that sense. There are influences in our lives, whether they're chemical or they're situational or environmental, whatever they are, right, that are trying to pull us away from happiness. They're trying to pull us away from eternal principles. They're trying to pull us away from reaching the throne of God. And that's what's happening here with Joseph Smith. Again, if we think about this not just as the adversary trying to stop the restoration, which certainly he is, but if we think about Joseph Smith as an individual and as the other prophets having the same experience, not just in the last days here, and that experience is our experience of going through the temple also, then we get a better understanding of what's happening here with the adversary. He's trying to stop Joseph Smith from going through the vision and getting to the throne of God. He's trying to stop us when we're working, when we're here in mortality. He tries to stop us from, in a metaphorical sense, getting to the throne of God, getting to the celestial kingdom, getting to the celestial room. So in the middle of this temptation, in the middle of, whether it's, we can look at it as temptation, but even in this case, it's more depression, darkness, anxiety. It's whatever is going to pull you away and destroy you, right? In the middle of this, he does something. He doesn't just give into it. Exerting all my powers, he has to give everything he has. That's the only way to get out of it. It's the only way to break through it. Exerting all my powers to call upon God to deliver me out of the power of this enemy, which had seized upon me. And remember, it's external. You're a child of God. Those things are external. They are carnal. They're part of our body. They're part of mortality and the environment around us. They're not part of you. They're not part of your spirit. So he calls upon God to deliver him out of the power of this enemy which had seized upon me. And at the very moment, I've had this experience with a couple of things. At the very moment when I was ready to sink into despair, that's on one end of the spectrum, despair, and abandon myself to destruction. Remember, he's not just giving up. He's giving all of his powers here. Not to an imaginary ruin, but to the power of some actual being from the unseen world who had such marvelous powers I had never before felt in any being. Just at this moment of great alarm, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head, above the brightness of the sun, right? Think of visions here, sun, moon, stars, etc. Above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. It no sooner appeared than I found myself delivered from the enemy which held me bound. So again, looking at this as a parallel experience to other prophets and their visions. Looking at this as Moses' vision. What was Moses' vision? The creation. That's a vision that he had. Same thing, right? The light comes out across the deep, across the abyss, across the void. And then there's organization, there's order. Now, another thing I want to point out here is that this pillar of fire, this pillar of light, is descending gradually upon him. Right? Again, back to the 1832 account, it came down from above and rested upon me, and I was filled with the Spirit of God. Right? It's coming out of the darkness. And what is the out of the darkness? You can also think of it as the Dark Ages. Right? It's from the time of Moroni up until the time of Joseph Smith, all the darkness, the lack of the new and everlasting covenant. I was filled with the Spirit of God. The Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord. Well, that's something that not necessarily happened immediately. Who knows what happened in going through that experience? Maybe it happened right away. Maybe it didn't. I don't know. Here's the 1835 account. As far as the adversary goes, he hears a person walking towards him. I strove to pray, but could not. The noise of walking seemed to draw nearer. I sprung up upon my feet. We can think about some of the videos, especially the more recent ones, where they're taking more and more of these accounts and witness testimony into account to make these videos. In the latest one I saw, you can see that actually as he walks into the clearing, sure enough, there's an axe sitting right there in a stump. And then he says that a pillar of fire appeared above my head. It presently rested down upon me and filled me with joy unspeakable. A personage appeared in the midst of this pillar of flame, which was spread all around, and yet nothing consumed. Another personage soon appeared like unto the first. He said unto me, thy sins are forgiven thee. Right? So that's important. It's one of the reasons he goes there, and that has to happen first. It probably happened before the vision expanded for him. He testified unto me that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Think about Nephi and the angelic tour guide, right? That brings him and shows him the meaning of the tree of life, which is basically the doctrine of Christ. And the focus there is about the Son of God. Now, the other thing he says here in the 1835 account is that he saw many angels, just like Lehi. Right? Again, even with Isaiah and others, and the book of Revelation with John the Revelator, you see these other figures. Again, trying to translate that from spiritual eyes to carnal eyes is a very difficult thing to do, I think. But he sees more there, and that's important. That is the counsel, right? That's the sod that you have in the Old Testament in Hebrew. It's what happens in the beginning, which is a representation of the Holy of Holies. And Joseph Smith has this doctrine about the council in heaven, especially toward the end of his life. But here it is right at the very beginning, in the first vision. He would have seen what would represent the council in heaven in 1820. Now, in the Joseph Smith history account, it says, when the light rested upon me, I saw two personages, whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, this is my beloved Son. Hear him. Something I've brought up, I think, before, but again, I think beloved Son may very well be a title. He says the same thing at Jesus' baptism. Well, again, beloved in Hebrew is David. Right? This is the Davidic king, the Davidic king. This to me would be something that would tie this experience and this identification of Jesus Christ to a temple drama that would have been given in Jerusalem in the Old Testament times. That's just my thought on this. And it would have been the same thing with John the Baptist when he baptizes Jesus, right? His father comes, the voice is heard, this is my beloved Son. Well, if that's a title, he's not just saying I love him. If that's a title, it's an identifier, right? This is who was represented in those temple dramas in public, especially the Feast of Tabernacles. This is who this figure is. It is the Messiah. It is Jehovah. Jesus Christ is Jehovah. That's what Jesus is Lord actually is saying in our English versions. It's Jesus is Jehovah. Now, let's go back to this pillar of fire and what's happening here, because I think this is important to see as part of an ascension experience here, like Lehi had, being carried away, or Nephi being carried away. Remember, Nephi says in his vision, whether I was carried away in the body or in spirit, I do not know. Something to that effect, right? They don't know exactly what's happening when they go through this, but they're carried away. Carried away. Well, is their body carried up in a way? Or are they entering into a spiritual world? Well, it says here in the 1842 account, I retired to a secret place in a grove and began to call upon the Lord. While fervently engaged in supplication, my mind was taken away from the objects with which I was surrounded, and I was enwrapped in a heavenly vision. So he's looking at the objects. So while this starts off, again, he's in the grove. He can see his axe, the stumps, the trees, the leaves, the ground, right? He's in a physical environment as this begins. But eventually he's taken away. He's carried away. Back to the 1835 account, which I had just gone over. The pillar of fire which was spread all around, yet nothing consumed. Right? So again, he's there in a physical environment. The trees are not being burned. Nothing is being burned. But then eventually he is carried away. And then eventually comes back to himself, so to speak, and he finds himself laying on the ground, looking up into the sky, up into the heavens. So this is an endowment type of an experience. This is a theophany of ascension. This is an apocalyptic vision that he's having, it seems to me. And as Don Bradley says, remember, he's the author of The Lost 116 Pages. He's a church historian, and he writes and speaks a lot on the first vision. And as he says, he thinks that, 200 years later here, we still are just barely grasping what happened with Joseph Smith in the first vision. Now, the last thing I want to bring up here is about what this is about, because this is going to lead right into the next several weeks, and really for the whole rest of the year. And that is about what is being restored, what is beginning to be said here by these visitations, first by the Father and the Son, and then by Moroni and others. Well, we know in the 1842 account that Joseph Smith received a promise that the fullness of the gospel, right there in the first vision, he doesn't tell him that he's going to start a church, doesn't tell him to go start one right now, right? But he does say that the fullness of the gospel should at some future time be made known unto me. In other words, you don't have the fullness of the gospel right now. It's not there. And that's what the restoration is all about. It's the new and everlasting covenant. It's the Abrahamic covenant. It's the higher law. It's the ordinances and administration of the Melchizedek priesthood. It's the patriarchal priesthood. If we go back to the last episode and we look at Doctrine and Covenants chapter 1, which is a beginning of talking about what this book of commandments, this Doctrine and Covenants is going to be about, we can see right in here in verse 22, it says that mine everlasting covenant might be established. That's what has to happen. Even when this was given here in 1831, right, that was still being unveiled as far as the wholeness of the everlasting covenant. It's probably still being unveiled. And then the immediate verse after that, 23, that the fullness of my gospel might be proclaimed by the weak and the simple unto the ends of the world and before kings and rulers. Well, in order to have the fullness of the gospel, you have to have the establishment of the everlasting covenant. And that's what the Book of Mormon has. So that becomes the tool that Moroni then brings to help us understand the new and everlasting covenant. And that's what we need to filter as we go through that book, through the Book of Mormon. And of course with the Doctrine and Covenants, because we're going to get a continual revelation, a revealing of the new and everlasting covenant for the last dispensation. And this is what we get in each of the dispensations. Before there's a falling away, right? It's everything is brought back to you at some point. It's that everything is there, right? The fullness of the gospel is there, the fullness of the priesthood, the fullness of the ordinances, the fullness of the Abrahamic covenant. It's just that little by little, or even boom, all at once, like with Moses, that higher law is removed and people fall away from it. That's what happened with Mormon and Moroni's people. And so the restoration of the gospel, the mission of Joseph Smith here, is to restore the new and everlasting covenant. And then you can preach the fullness of the gospel. So this experience with Joseph Smith, yes, it is an opening of the heavens to bring the restoration of the gospel, the restoration of the church, right, to the earth again. It is an opening of heavens where they have been closed for so long, from, as far as we know, from the time of Moroni. And he happens to be the messenger that's going to come next. But it's also the beginning of unfolding, of revealing the new and everlasting covenant through the form of priesthood, which is going to happen with John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John, and Elijah, and many, many others that are going to bring the keys to Joseph Smith. It's a restoration of the temple ordinances that support that new and everlasting covenant. It's a more clear understanding of the doctrine of Christ that had been removed up to the time of Joseph Smith, especially about the understanding of us needing to become like Christ because we are co-heirs with him. And then also applying very specifically to Joseph Smith and therefore to each of us individually, because Joseph Smith kind of represents us in this case. This is a vision of ascension. It's a vision of, it's a temple imagery vision is what is happening here. It is in many ways an endowment type of event, an endowment experience. And just as Joseph is shown that he can ascend all the way to the throne of God, each of us also have that opportunity. And we metaphorically go through that when we go to the temple. And so the temple being put together was not something that happened in Nauvoo or Kirtland prior, right? The temple doctrine was something that was thrust upon Joseph Smith right from the very beginning, right here in the first vision, and right away with Moroni. And I think we'll be able to see this very clearly as we go through the beginnings here of the Doctrine and Covenants in church history. I'll talk to you next time.